Okay, hello everybody. My name is Laura and I'm the Natural Heritage Project Officer for Binevenagh and Coastal Lowlands Landscape Partnership Scheme. We also have Aisling and Andrew from the team here too. This is my first time hosting a Zoom workshop, so bear with me if we have any hiccups along the way. While everyone has been living in the world of Zoom this past year, so I've been off on maternity leave, so I'm only getting up to speed with online life. So just want to go over some housekeeping before we get started. Can I ask you all to keep yourselves on mute to avoid any interference during the presentation? We're going to have some time at the end of the workshop for questions, so please add your questions to the chat box and Aisling will pick these up. We'll be recording the workshop, so anyone who doesn't want to be in the recording can turn their camera off. We'll have a short break halfway through the presentation to allow you all to get a wee cup of tea and a trip to the loo. Make sure you've all provided the correct email address, as we'll be contacting you all via email with further instructions on how to collect your free native garden plant. So each of you will receive a £20 credit, which you can use to purchase free native plants from the following plants. So we have oxeye daisy, red campion, honeysuckle, dogwood, field scabious, or a box of wildflowers, and these will be available to collect at Seacoast Nurseries. I'll be handing over control of Zoom to Karl, so if you have any issues throughout the workshop, pop a message into the chat box or email me at laura@ccght.org. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to Karl Hamilton from Eco Mantella. Karl has a wealth of knowledge and experience delivering training workshops on topics such as birds of prey, identification of the wildflowers of Ireland, and animal tracking, to name a few, and has also carried out some guided walks for us up in Binevenagh Nature Reserve, which are always well attended. So I'll now hand over to Karl. Karl, just if anybody, whenever I hand over control, can you keep an eye out if anybody's in the waiting room?
Yeah, absolutely.
So making you the host now, Karl.
Okay, I'll just share the screen then.
Okay.
Okay, there we go. Okay, folks, so thanks very much for joining us this morning. As Laura says, I'm an ecologist that specializes in botany and birds. So I'm also a keen gardener as well. So this topic this morning is a nice sort of hybrid topic of botany and also a little bit of horticulture and sort of gardening as well. So we're going to be looking at some of the plant species that we find in our gardens and garden centres and nurseries around the country, which can be quite invasive, some more so than others. And we're going to be looking at kind of what makes them invasive, what characteristics of their natural history makes them invasive or quite prolific, and also suitable alternative plants that we can plant in their place. And I have in the past been guilty of buying and planting some of these plants in the garden myself and finding out, the hard way just how prolific they can be. I'm still paying the consequences with some of them. So a little bit of this is from personal experience, and we'll probably have some of these plants in our gardens as well. And it might be a little bit surprising to some people that not all the alternative plants that we've recommended are actually native plants. A lot of them are, but if, like me, you're a gardener and you like things from maybe far-flung places like China and Japan, and you do like a little bit of ornamental aspect to your garden, we'll have, as some of these alternative plants, we've provided some suitable sort of non-invasive species that you can plant that wouldn't necessarily be native either. So we'll jump straight in. So what do we kind of mean by non-native plant species? Well, by and large, it's species which haven't been found in Ireland since the end of the last ice age, and they haven't kind of found their way here under their own steam, so they've been brought over or assisted by humans. And there's many thousands of non-native plant species that have been deliberately brought over by man for purposes of agriculture, horticulture, or maybe they've been accidentally introduced, for example, brought in as seeds attached to sheep wool, for example, or something like that. And quite often, anyone who goes to the garden centre, you get a little potted plant, you bring it home, you plant it, and you don't just get the plant you paid for, you get all the weeds that are also in the compost of the soil as well, which you then have to contend with. So a lot of plants kind of find their way into your garden and then into the wild, in the compost, sort of inadvertently. So the species we're going to be looking at today have mostly been sort of planted intentionally, and they've kind of then just got a little bit out of control. And in many of these plant species that have been introduced, they're not native to this part of the world. They're important to our economy. So if you think of all our cereal crops, for example, wheat, barley, rye, corn, and so on, and also horticulturally as well, there's a lot of plants are very, very economically beneficial to the horticultural trade. As we're going to see, a lot of these species haven't become established outside of gardens. They're not very invasive or very prolific. And they really need quite a little bit of tender love and care to actually survive and thrive and flower and produce seeds. So they're never really going to establish themselves in the wild. But a very small number of the plant species that we do bring in do turn out to be invasive. And as we're going to see, that's because they have a suite of characteristics which sort of predisposes them to doing really well in this part of the world. And by definition, an invasive species is defined as an alien species whose introduction and/or spread threatens our local and native biodiversity. So these species establish themselves in the wild. They do well outside of sort of a controlled environment, such as a garden, and they cause a range of sort of negative impacts, both economically, ecologically, and/or socially as well. So things like Japanese knotweed, which is probably the best known species, is a really good example. Although we're not going to cover a lot of these really well-known invasive species today because, of course, hopefully no one grows them in the garden. Hopefully most people kind of know about them. So today we're going to be covering the slightly lesser known species. And just incidentally, these 4 photographs that you can see here, this is these 2 photographs at the bottom are an invasive species called salmonberry, which is a North American equivalent of our wild raspberry. And then these photographs on the, we'll just go back one. These photographs on the left are our wild raspberry. Obviously the flowers and the fruits look very different for these 2 species, but when they're not producing leaves or flowers, they can look very, very similar. And therein lies part of the problem with invasive species is they can be overlooked when they're in the wild unless you really know what you're looking for. So you don't know to control these if you can't identify them in the first place. So we're going to touch on a little bit of that throughout the presentation. So sort of touched on the first slide there that invasive non-native species are quite a big threat sort of in terms of our ecology, our biodiversity here in Northern Ireland. And they're actually the second biggest threat after habitat loss and fragmentation. So obviously if species of plants and animals don't have the correct habitats to live, they'll die out. Or if those populations of plants and animals get fragmented, which is a big, big problem with lots of species today, then they're at risk of local extinction piecemeal across the country. But second to that is the march of invasive species. So photograph in the middle here shows the most serious contender, which is Japanese knotweed, which everyone's probably more than well aware of, and we've all probably seen. To the right, we have Spanish bluebell, which is in a lot of people's gardens, and they probably just think they've got nice bluebells, but they've actually got these non-native species, which are causing lots and lots of problems for our native bluebell populations here in Northern Ireland. And even cherry laurel, which is even nowadays very, very popularly used as a hedging plant. Outside of a well-maintained garden environment, it can cause real problems in areas of woodland and sort of set-aside areas that aren't subject to any habitat management. So as I've already mentioned, half the battle for these botanical invasive species is being aware of what they are, being able to identify them from our native plant species, our native flora, and that will allow you to then work out a little bit of control is needed here. So the big, I guess the big take-home message for today, before we kind of really get our teeth into this subject, is to do your research before you buy any plants. Obviously, as perhaps gardeners, we're all kind of impulsive, and you're out for a nosy and you see, oh, that looks nice, I'll buy that. And then you get home and you realize, oops, this thing's going to take over the front garden. So really kind of plan what you're interested in having in your garden. Do a lot of research And that might mean going on to websites and looking at resources, literature that's not necessarily designed just for gardeners. So look at, for example, the natural history of a species, really investigate how kind of prolific or invasive it might be before you plant it, and a year or two later you give yourself a bit of a headache trying to control it. So through the centuries, especially in the last few hundred years, people have brought literally tens of thousands of different types of plant species into this part of the world, either as garden plants in private estates, as forestry trees, pond plants, or as part of habitat management projects for conservation. Some, as I mentioned earlier, have also arrived accidentally, attached to wool or in the soil with other plants or something like that, have arrived sort of incidentally. And of all these species, the only ones that actually turn out to be invasive have a range of traits which allow them to really take advantage once they get here and establish themselves. So what you generally get with these invasive species is lured into a false sense of security initially. And what they actually do is they don't really take off initially. It takes a little while, maybe a few years, for them to become established in sort of natural or wild areas until their populations reach a critical mass beyond which they kind of then explode. And then we realize they're actually a bit of a problem. So that initial period of slow growth where they kind of behave themselves and they're very unobtrusive and they tend to kind of do what you want them to do is called a lag period, and that can last for an indeterminate period of time. It can be as little a period of time as 1 or 2 years. It might be a few decades, and then eventually they just take off. Now the problem with this lag period is that as more and more plant species are brought in by the horticultural trade and planted in our gardens, there's no real indication that they're invasive in this part of the world until they're well established in our gardens and in the horticultural trade, and then we realize, oops, we've just added another invasive species to our list. So it is quite problematic in that respect. So some of the traits that they might need to have, for example, they would tolerate a relatively mild oceanic climate or weather in our seasons. So our winters, by and large, tend not to be very severe, which can kill off a lot of the more tender invasive species if you have a really harsh winter and deep frost. Our summers tend to be quite mild. They don't tend to be really blisteringly warm, which again could kill off a lot of these slightly more tender species that maybe come from more temperate or cold climates. They won't do well in strong sunlight for any length of time. So because we have quite a mild, temperate oceanic climate, that can actually help a lot of these species survive. And indeed, a lot of these invasive species come from similar temperate environments, places like New Zealand, Japan, China, places like that. A lot of these invasive plant species can also survive and grow on a wide range of soil types. So they're pretty easy to please. In other words, they're not too fussy about whether the soil is acidic or neutral or base rich. They're able to kind of survive and grow on all those. So they're not very fussy, which helps as well, makes them quite adaptable in their native range. It also unfortunately makes them very successful outside of their native range. A lot of these species, once they establish and get through that initial slow lag period of growth, they can grow very, very fast, and that allows them to outcompete native species or more well-behaved species in our garden or in a wild setting. And some of these species will actually grow and be so prolific and grow so rapidly, they actually are what is called ecosystem engineers, where they'll actually alter their own environment, alter the environment around them to accommodate their own needs to the detriment of other plant species. So if you have a species like that in your garden, it's just literally going to take over, and unless you really sort of hammer it each year, that's all you'll be left with in the garden. A lot of these species can propagate themselves very, very rapidly and readily from vegetative parts, so fragments of stem, even fragments of leaf or root or rhizome. And a lot of these species can also produce absolutely huge quantities of seeds. So if you let these garden plants go to seed without deadheading them beforehand, they just seed all over the garden, and they can become a real nightmare come springtime the following year. And the big kicker for a lot of these invasive non-native species is that they're free outside of their natural range. They're free from a lot of diseases and from potential predators, I suppose you could call them, grazers, which would keep their populations in check in the wild. So if someone, for example, goes to China on a botanical exploration, they find a new species of rhododendron, for example, it's brought back and cultivated and found to do quite well in this part of the world. That's then sold in the horticultural trade. What very rarely happens is that the plant material that they bring back also brings back disease. So no one wants diseased plants in their garden. And certainly no one wants non-native invertebrates nibbling on their plants either. So they're usually cleaned from all these things before they're brought in. And when they're free from release from grazing pressure or diseases or viruses or anything like that, of course, they just explode. So the first species is one which you don't see too much in our garden centres and nurseries anymore, but it's more of a problem from sort of past times, and can find its way into your garden, is snowberry. These are found in a lot of old gardens or old unkempt gardens. And it's a deciduous shrub, small shrub from North America. Again, it's a species that does well in temperate climate. And it's often found in old hedges and in woods, where historically one of the reasons it would have been planted was as game cover for partridge and in particular for pheasant rearing. And it's quite prone to suckering, which allows it to form quite dense shaded thickets. And now by suckering, all suckering means is that the underground parts of the plants, i.e. the roots, can actually throw up shoots. So the roots don't just grow downwards, they grow sideways. And as they grow laterally, they can throw up shoots just at random. And that means that a single plant can actually become a thicket, a dense thicket, which shades the ground within and underneath, so nothing else can grow there. And very, very distinctive. It's got these nice sort of oval leaves, which can occasionally have a little lobe or a tooth on them. And then late summer, early autumn, they get these very distinctive white berries, which of course give the species its name. And they're palatable to birds, but they're not edible. They're sort of mildly to moderately toxic to us, so they're definitely not something to forage, but they are edible by small mammals and birds. So again, some of these invasive species, although they're by and large detrimental to our native biodiversity, some of them, such as snowberry, can actually contrive some benefit as well. So you could argue that you would plant it because it gives a source of sort of late summer, early autumn food for small mammals and birds, and it also creates those dense thicket habitats, which are beneficial place for small mammals to hide, and also for birds to build their nests free from predation by crows and things. So while it does confer some small advantages to biodiversity, on the whole, it's detrimental. And two very suitable alternatives, which have very similar growth habit, but they don't produce sort of monospecific stands or thickets. And these are both native species, would be Guelder rose on the left here, which tends to be quite common in places like West Armagh and Fermanagh, where the soils are quite base rich, but it will also grow in neutral and slightly acidic soils in your garden as well. And you see it produces berries, so it contrives the same benefits to biodiversity as snowberry, a source of food for birds and small mammals, but it's not invasive. It, again, is native to this part of the world, so it tends to behave itself quite well. And a second species is spindle, or European spindle, Euonymus. This is the native Euonymus, which has these lovely pink and orange flowers from mid to late summer, and they then turn into berries again, which are a source of food for birds and small mammals. And they both behave themselves quite well, and they can both be pruned back if they get too unkempt in your garden, so they can be managed quite easily. And being native species, there's a lot of insects and vertebrates that benefit from them. For example, there's a lot of pollinators would benefit from the flowers, whereas when snowberry flowers, there's very few invertebrates, relatively few invertebrates can access the nectar and the pollen and things inside the flowers of non-native species. And you can find both Guelder rose and spindle in nurseries and garden centres if you keep an eye out for them. So Guelder rose is our native viburnum species, and spindle is our native Euonymus or spindle species. And there's a particularly nice sort of garden variety of spindle called Red Cascade, which gets beautiful red leaves in the autumn before the leaves drop off, because these are both deciduous species. Another problematic species when it's sort of not really trimmed and looked after properly in a garden setting is cherry laurel, which is very, very commonly planted as hedges in new housing developments and places like that. And it's native to the Caucasus, the Black Sea area, just beyond Eastern Europe. So again, quite sort of temperate climate, but it actually finds places like Ireland to its liking, because it doesn't have the really cold, harsh continental winters to worry about. It's quite mild all year here. It doesn't have the really intense continental summers either. So it does very well here without extremes of temperature or weather. And as a result, again, doesn't have any diseases or anything to keep it in check. Initially, it would have been planted in quite wealthy estates and large gardens in the Victorian period. And now it's very popularly planted by lots of councils, for example, or developers within housing developments and places like that. So you'll see this in car parks and places like that. And it also suckers like snowberry. So the roots will throw up shoots at random. And it will also do something called layer, which means that when the branches of mature cherry laurel trees actually touch the ground, the branch knows it's touched the ground, it's in contact with growing medium, and it will then establish roots, which root it into the ground, and it will then from that establish a new plant, which then grows skyward. So just like snowberry, it can form sort of single species thickets or stands, and it also does quite well in shaded habitats. So places like woodlands, hedgerows, it can establish as an understory species, and it can be a bit of a nightmare to get rid of once it's established. And what cherry laurel does is, because it's got these evergreen, these quite large, up to about 12, 15 centimeter long, sort of dark green waxy leaves, they're evergreen, so it shades the ground out underneath quite heavily, and very little to nothing can actually grow underneath. Even ivy has a hard job growing underneath the shade of cherry laurel. Now, on the whole, it's not a really aggressive invasive species. So again, if it's in a garden setting, you trim it as a hedge, you cut it back, you don't let any, in particular, any berries develop on the plants. It's quite easy to manage, but the problem arises where you have berries, because birds will eat the berries, and then of course birds will go and roost somewhere outside your garden. First thing they do the next morning is defecate, and of course in the droppings are the seeds, which are dropped onto the ground in a nice little package of fertilizer, and boom, you get some feral cherry laurel growing in places like woodlands and hedgerows, in areas where it's not managed, and that's when it causes a bit of a problem. So two alternatives, which unfortunately are a little bit more slow growing, are holly, our native holly, Ilex aquifolium, and also our native yew, taxus. And again, these are very widely available in garden centres. They can be planted as hedging or as specimen trees in the garden, and they're evergreen, so they do exactly the same job as cherry laurel, but they are a little bit more slow growing, kind of about 6 inches a year, against cherry laurel's kind of 12 to 15 inches a year. So if you're a patient gardener or horticulturist, these are the two species to plant. And again, if you like something a little bit more unusual, you can get lots of variegated and sort of wacky forms of both yew and holly that are just a little bit more unusual, rather than the sort of straight wild species. They also confer the same benefits to biodiversity as cherry laurel, so they both produce berries, which are a source of food for small mammals and birds. Now, incidentally, with holly, holly is a species in which males and females are on different plants. So if you do want to plant holly and get the red berries, you have to plant a female holly. And there's no way of knowing it's a female holly until it flowers, and you look at the reproductive parts of the flowers to see whether it has the pistil or the style or stigma, which would be the female part of the flower. It also means if you want to get red berries, you have to plant a male holly quite close to the female one, so that they can cross-pollinate and produce the berries. So just something to keep in mind if you really want to get the red berries for winter Christmas wreaths or something like that. Another nightmare, which unfortunately is still really readily sold in garden centres and nurseries, is Himalayan honeysuckle, sometimes called pheasantberry, Lycisteria. And this is really effective. It grows like stink in your garden. So if you have maybe an ugly fence or an ugly wall, it's great for kind of covering that with nice green foliage and these nice sort of pendulous purpley red flower spikes in the summer. But it is entirely deciduous. So all this cover will die back in the wintertime to nothing. And it's really effective at colonizing disturbed ground. So again, outside of a well-maintained garden where you can kind of prick up any little seedlings, which are quite distinctive, it will form thickets a bit like snowberry or cherry laurel. And again, the problem arises when the seeds are produced. Birds will eat the seeds, fly away and disperse them somewhere where it's probably not wanted. And therein lies the problem. And it also gets to a fair height, sort of 2.5 meters tall, which again, a lot of people don't like things getting tall in their garden. So it's not great as a garden plant, to be fair. But there's a lot of different varieties of cultivars that are sold in garden centres and nurseries. So it's just one to look out for and kind of avoid if you can. And this is another one which you don't really see in nurseries and garden centres anymore, thankfully, which is salmonberry. And this is the sort of North American equivalent of our wild raspberry, if you like. It's a rubus, so it's a member of the rose family. And it's related to raspberry, bramble, things like that. And it was introduced into the UK in 1827, so quite a long time ago, just before the Victorian period. And it was initially planted as a garden ornamental. So, I mean, the flowers and the fruit are quite nice. A bit like wild raspberry. And unlike bramble, it doesn't have those sort of harsh prickles you would expect from a bramble or a rose. So it's quite easy to manage with your bare hands. And it was also planted in areas of woodland as game cover as well. So for pheasants and partridge. And in that respect, it forms thickets. So it was beneficial as game cover, but it also suckers and produces quite dense single species thickets and stands as well, up to 3 meters tall. So again, planted in your garden and not kept under strict control, it can kind of take over and become unmanageable very, very quickly. Again, the same problem arises when you get the fruit, the sort of salmony, pinky orange fruit produced. It can be eaten by small mammals and birds, which will then disperse it beyond the woodland or the garden where it was planted. And salmonberry seems to be a real problem in the west, where it's a little bit wetter, obviously. And you'll find this growing along sort of farm tracks and lanes. And again, most people just think it's wild raspberry. They don't understand that these sort of pink flowers and these orangey pink fruits are actually a more insidious species. So again, most people just don't know what it is, and they don't understand that it's very, very invasive. Another species which, again, you can buy quite readily and is planted along road verges and motorways absolutely all up and down the country is Japanese rose, Rosa rugosa. So if you're sitting on the Sydenham bypass in traffic, for example, like in the central reservation, just outside Belfast City Airport, you'll see this stuff growing all along the central reservation. And it grows very, very quickly. So from a sort of road service or council perspective, it grows really quickly. It fills up an area. It flowers very profusely, so it looks nice. And then when the flowers die back, you get these nice ovoid rose hips, which again are a source of food for birds. So it's an easy sort of landscaping option, but it can take over. And again, birds will disperse the seeds well away from where they're wanted into the wider environment. And it can cause problems, for example, in quite sensitive habitats like sand dunes and species-rich grasslands and places like that. So again, it produces these single species thickets which shade out all our native vegetation. And certainly in a garden setting, it can be a bit of a thug just because it grows really, really quickly. So again, one to watch out for and to sort of avoid if you can. And there are alternatives, which are all native species. So we've got 3 native roses, the most common of which is in the middle here. This is Rosa canina, or common dog rose. To the left here, we have Sherard's downy rose, which is probably the second most common wild rose species. slightly deeper pink flowers. The leaves or leaflets tend to be a sort of a more grey green rather than the deep glossy green of common dog rose. And then we've got field rose, which is lovely white flowers. Tends to be more common, a little bit rare in the wild, but again, if you go to specialist nurseries, you can find these species and plant them. And you know, they very, very slowly form the same thickets that, for example, Japanese rose would form, but because they're much slower growing, they're much easier to control as well. They're never going to become kind of thuggish. So just some of our native rose species you can keep an eye out for. You can buy these bare rooted, which makes them really, really cheap, kind of 10, 15p a plant, and plant them during the autumn and winter. And yeah, they'll do just grand. So another species which is quite contentious and unfortunately can still be found, as I found to my detriment, in garden centres, is our non-native Spanish bluebell. And it looks, until you get your eye in, it does look just like our native bluebell. And the problem arises here just with awareness. A lot of people just think a bluebell is a bluebell, and that's definitely not the case, because Spanish bluebell, as its name suggests, comes from the Iberian Peninsula in southwestern Europe, where it's native to. Outside of the range of our native bluebell, Hyacinthioides non-scripta, which is the only native species here in British Isles and Western Europe. And the problem is it was introduced as a garden plant, so it grows taller than our native species. It also has different coloured flowers, which don't kind of droop down. They kind of sit to the side or even oriented upwards. So they're different growth habit. They are a nice plant, but the problem is that not only are they very prolific as a species, but the big problem in this part of the world is they hybridize, they form fertile hybrids with our native bluebells. And so now if you go into even quite remote woodlands here in Northern Ireland and you see these lovely carpets of bluebells during May and early June, when you look at them, there are a lot of native bluebells, but when you really get your eye in, you'll see there's a lot of hybrids with Spanish bluebell as well. And how we think this is happening is that obviously pollinators, like honeybees, which can travel kind of up to 2 or 3 miles away from their hive, are carrying the pollen from Spanish bluebell into the populations of native bluebell, and they're diluting the sort of genetics of our native bluebell, which is quite sad. So we may already be at a point in Northern Ireland where we don't have any pure genetic stock of native bluebells, even in very remote woodlands in Fermanagh and places like that. So quite sad. And that's the real danger with these hybrids. A lot of species or a lot of plants that are sold in nurseries and garden centres as native bluebells, when you actually put them in your garden and grow them out, they're hybrids. And I found this myself, and I've had to dig them up and put them in the compost bin. So it's a real problem. And there's 2 real slightly deeper problems with Spanish bluebell and native bluebell. One of the problems is that the hybrids, as I've mentioned, are fertile. So they can hybridize with both pure Spanish and pure English bluebells. They produce a whole range of physical characteristics, which can make the hybrids very difficult to separate or to identify in the wild. But as a general rule, Spanish bluebell will have paler flowers, as you can see here. They're arranged radially around the flower spike, whereas in English bluebell, the native species, all the flowers all hang downwards. They droop when they're fully mature, and much, much darker purple color, and they're only arranged along one side of the flowering spike. Another difference is that the what we would call the tepals or petals in Spanish bluebell they're usually straight. They might have a slight curve on the outside, but they're certainly not curled in at the edges like they would be in the native bluebell. Spanish bluebell has a mild scent, whereas our native bluebell is very heavily scented. And again, that's an adaptation to, in part, attract our native pollinators. So the degree of scent can be a bit of a giveaway. And if you actually look inside the flowers, the color of the pollen can be a giveaway. So the pollen of our native bluebell is white. That of Spanish bluebell is blue. So again, you tend to have sort of very pale blue pollen in the hybrids. So these are a list of characteristics for the straight species. Hybrids will have characteristics which are to some extent intermediate, which makes them a little bit tricky to identify. And also Spanish bluebell, as I mentioned earlier, grows taller. The leaves are wider and longer. Everything about it is kind of bigger and bolder and more brash than our more delicate native bluebell species. Now, apart from the fact that hybrids can be quite difficult to identify, the second slightly deeper problem we have with Spanish bluebells is that Spanish bluebell is one of the species that's listed on Schedule 9 of the Wildlife Order, which is our kind of first key piece of wildlife legislation we got here in 1985 in Northern Ireland, which protects some species. But Schedule 9 of that order actually lists invasive plant species which shouldn't be sold or planted because they're invasive. So it's a list of invasive species. Spanish bluebell is on that list. So from 1985, it's actually been illegal to grow and sell commercially, offer for sale Spanish bluebell. But again, very difficult to enforce because our Environment Agency here is so underfunded and understaffed that they just can't enforce. They can't go around garden centres and nurseries and find these and take them off the shelves. But unfortunately now it's not just the straight species that's being sold, it's the hybrids as well. And they really need to be in flower. So a lot of garden centres would sell bluebells when they're just in leaf, take them home, you plant them out. It's only when they go to flower you realise you don't have the native species, and of course it's too late. So the reason this is such a big problem is that you do sometimes get the hybrids in Spanish bluebell sold in plant fairs, for example. So private gardeners would maybe have excess plants, they take them along to a plant fair and they sell them on to other gardeners. You will see a lot of Spanish bluebells getting sold in that way. So again, just learn the characteristics of the native bluebell and just be very, very wary of bringing in Spanish bluebell to your garden. It's also quite prolific in your garden as well. It's not as well behaved as the native bluebell. But the native bluebell is actually protected by the same legislation, which means you can't dig it up in the wild. So it's a lot of people in times gone past would have dug up bluebells and primroses and put them in their garden. And that was happening to such a scale where in 1985, the Environment Agency and the government decided enough's enough, we'll have to legally protect these in the wild so that people don't go and continue to dig them up anymore. So if you think about that for a little second, on one hand, you have Spanish bluebell, which is illegal to sell. It's not illegal to have in your garden or allowed to grow in your garden. It is illegal to dig it up and sell it or to give it to someone else, but you're allowing it to spread in the environment. And on the other hand, if you have a bluebell in your garden that's native and you mistake it for Spanish bluebell, you dig it up, you're actually guilty of an offence there as well. So we've actually run workshops in the past on this where the organizer wanted to maybe go out, have a little bit of a volunteer work party afterwards and dig up areas of non-native bluebell, which is very difficult to do because you can't guarantee that every single bluebell you're digging up isn't a native one, which would then get you into a bit of trouble. So the same legislation makes it illegal to dig these ones up, but also makes it illegal to sell these ones. So it's very, very tricky. So as a general rule, we don't recommend planting bluebells in your garden for that reason, because it's very difficult to know exactly what you have unless you do genetic testing first. So a much more viable alternative than bluebells is to just go for another spring flowering species, which provides the same impact of color, which is something like wood anemone. And again, there are non-native species available to plant in your garden, but it can be a wee bit more thuggish. But the native species, anemone nemorosa, which again you'll find flowering in woods, April, May time, behaves itself very, very well. And it flowers the exact same time as bluebell. So it does the same job without any of the same headaches. Now, another species again, which is really widely sold in garden centres, and it's quite a contentious one because it does provide a lot of benefits to biodiversity, especially our pollinators, is butterfly bush or summer lilac, as it's sometimes called, Buddleia davidii. Now, there are actually lots of different species of Buddleia that you can plant in your garden. It's only really Buddleia Davidii that is recognized as a bit of an invasive species at this stage. And this photograph on the right kind of demonstrates why. It can grow in very, very thin, nutrient-poor soils. And again, if you don't get your gutters or cleaned out once a year, you get a thin layer of nice skeletal soil in there, perfect place for the seeds of Buddleia to germinate. And of course, if you don't go up there and rip it out, it can actually start to break apart the structure of your roof and do quite a lot of damage to your property. So you'll see this in around sort of inner city Belfast, growing 2-3 stories up. And again, most animals don't look up, so most people don't see it until they get a serious leak and there's some damage to the property. And then when they investigate it, it's because of good old Buddleia. It's got in under the roof tiles and created a hole in the roof structure. So again, in a garden setting where it's trimmed back, it's sort of quite heavily coppiced or pruned every 2 or 3 years, that's fine. It's whenever the seeds end up being dispersed by the wind or by birds, or by water indeed as well, and it ends up somewhere where it's not maintained quite heavily, it can form these huge thickets and seed freely and cause a real headache. So all it needs is a little crack in the mortar, or again, this thin soil in a gutter. Seeds get in there and the rest is history. They can cause quite a bit of damage. And you'll actually see Buddleia growing on quite a lot of listed buildings in Belfast as well, which of course is a real headache. But the big advantage it confers as a garden plant, where it is maintained, is that it's an absolute magnet for pollinators like hoverflies and solitary bees and butterflies as well, and dayfly moths. So not to dissuade anyone from planting it as a garden plant, but do make sure you remove the flower heads before they go to seed, because like so many of our invasives we've talked about so far, the seeds will get dispersed by birds, and you're inadvertently affecting a spread sort of out into the wider environment where it is a bit of a thug. So like so many of these species, enjoy the flowers. At that stage, it confers a lot of benefits to biodiversity, but then deadhead before it goes to seed. Another species, which again, you can see quite readily in a lot of garden centres, are the wood sorrels, oxalis species. And the most pernicious of these is a very, very small species which produces mats or carpets quite readily, called yellow wood sorrel, Oxalis corniculata. Again, beautiful little species to have in your shrubberies and your planting beds. And a bit like creeping buttercup, it spreads vegetatively by these above ground sort of horizontal stems or runners, which root at the nodes. So it spreads very, very quickly. But as you can see in both of these photographs, it can pop up in little crevices in paving slabs or in masonry, and can be really difficult to get on top of. So we have a little white flowered species, Binevenagh, in the garden, and we've been trying to control it for 3 years now. We don't really like to use chemicals, so we're just pulling up the plants we're trying to uproot, and we still haven't got on top of it. So again, if species like this get into your garden, they can end up getting out of your planting bed, in between your paving slabs, and just be a real nuisance more than anything else. So again, if you see these wood sorrel species, a lot of them are very pernicious. They're very rapidly growing and they're a real nuisance in the garden. So I tend to just avoid them. And they have this kind of nice 3-leaf clover appearance. And again, as I say, the flowers quite profusely all through the growing season, but it's just a real headache to actually get rid of. Alternatives would be to native species, which again, very attractively colored. The foliage is quite nice when they're not in flower. And they also confer a lot of benefits to biodiversity, which we're going to talk about in a wee second. And these are both members of the pea family. So again, if you're a gardener, you probably know what type of soil you have, be it neutral, slightly acidic, basic, or lime rich. Either or, there's a species of bird's foot trefoil which will suit your needs. So if you've got neutral to slightly basic or lime rich soil, then bird's foot trefoil, or the common bird's foot, is the one you want to go for. If you've got slightly acidic soil, then you want to go for greater bird's foot trefoil, the one on the right here. They both grow in slightly different soil types in the wild, and you can use that to your advantage in the garden. So they'll grow in a very similar way to your wood sorrels, but much more slowly, and they don't seed as readily, and they don't grow using runners or anything like that. So they're much easier to control, much better behaved, and they confer much more benefit to biodiversity. And the reason for that is that members of the pea family, their nectar is very rich in protein, which is a very, very important resource for pollinators. So if you're a butterfly or a moth or a bumblebee, there's lots of flowers in the garden, of course, that produce sugar-rich nectar, but there's very few plants in the garden, unless they're members of the pea family, that will actually produce nectar which is high in protein, which of course our pollinators need, especially during this part of the year when they're raising up their grubs in the nest. And they are a big must in your garden if you like to attract in the pollinators. And two of the best species are these two bird's foot trefoils. Now, to tell the difference between the two isn't easy. Common bird's foot trefoil has leaves which have very few, if any, hairs, and just a small number of flowers per flower head. And if you were to break open the stem of common bird's foot trefoil is solid. In greater bird's foot trefoil, the stems and the leaflets tend to be hairy. There's more flowers in a flower head than you would find in common bird's foot. And if you break open the stem, it's actually hollow like a straw inside. So there's 2 or 3 different ways to tell the difference between the two species. Another species which a lot of gardeners will want, maybe you're into your herbal, your homeopathy or your herbal remedies, or maybe like me, you plant comfrey to make an organic fertilizer for the garden. The common comfrey as a straight species can, although it's very beneficial for lots of different reasons, it also attracts a lot of pollinators, which is good, but it can form these dense single species clumps, and it can behave as a bit of a thug in the garden. You're forever digging it out and giving plants away or composting the stuff. And so while it's very advantageous from an alternative medicines point of view, or for pollinators, or for organic fertilizer in the garden, it is a bit of a thug, and medium to long term, it's probably just not worthwhile growing. The good news is nowadays there is a much better alternative which doesn't seed as readily as common comfrey does as a straight species. It's much more better behaved, doesn't spread vegetatively as profusely as common comfrey, and it's a cultivar of Russian comfrey called Symphytum uplandigum Bocking 14. And again, more and more garden centres and nurseries are twigging on to this, and they're starting to actually stock this. So Bocking 14 is the cultivar you want to go for. It has all the advantages of comfrey. So it produces lots of flowers, great for pollinators. You can, again, chop it up, put it in a bucket full of water, leave it to steep for a few months, and it forms this absolutely horrid liquid, which is a great organic fertilizer for the garden, but it stinks to high heaven, but it is a great way to produce your own fertilizer, save yourself an absolute ton of money, keep all your plants flowering throughout the year. But it doesn't spread by runners. It's sterile, so it doesn't seed freely around the garden. Very, very easy to control. So look out for Russian comfrey, Bocking 14. It's the kind of panacea in the garden. And again, probably doesn't have the same homeopathic or herbal benefits of common comfrey. In that instance, if you're growing comfrey for those reasons, I would probably recommend, if you do grow it in the garden, again, deadhead it before it goes to seed, or grow it in a pot where you can move it around the garden. It won't then spread by runners, won't spread vegetatively and take over your planting beds. And again, you might see kind of guidelines online for making this organic fertilizer from comfrey. For some reason, it's called comfrey tea. Whatever you do, don't drink it. It's poisonous. It has the consistency of quite thick tea, but it's only to be used as a fertilizer, obviously, in the garden. Another species, which again, a lot of people will have in their garden, you occasionally see it in garden centres, is this stuff, which is my nemesis. We have wild trouble. Every garden we've had wild trouble getting rid of this stuff. Purple toad flax. Nice little sort of greeny grey whorls of leaves. Nice little purple flower spikes all throughout the summer. Beautiful species, but it seeds and spreads like wildfire. And again, it can crop up between paving slabs, and we've even had it grown out of the walls and everything. So while it looks nice, it doesn't cast a heavy shade around it because the leaves are quite narrow, quite widely spaced. So things can grow within it. Like I see some marjoram and things here, some briginias. It just spreads itself all throughout the garden and can be a bit of a nightmare. So for that reason, it's kind of one to avoid. It's just more of a nuisance rather than a thug in the garden. Again, pollinators will visit the flowers, so it does have some advantages to biodiversity, but it's more just from the nuisance point of view. And again, if it spreads outside your garden into a wild setting, sort of brownfield sites and places like that in urban areas, it would be quite common. It again can kind of take over and just be a bit of a nuisance to try and get rid of. So two very viable alternatives in the same family would be snapdragons and Andirrhinum. As you can see, very beneficial to pollinators, but doesn't seed as readily and much easier to control as well. And the flowers are kind of bigger as well. So to me, it has more visual impact in the garden. What we have snapdragons in the garden, great for pollinators, adds a nice splash of color, but we also have our native Echium vulgare, which is Viper's bugloss. This is our only native Echium species. And you'll find this growing in the wild in places like Killard Point, Murlock sand dunes, so it likes quite freely draining soil. But it is an absolute magnet for pollinators. It's the best plant for pollinators in the garden by far. So Viper's bugloss. Don't make the same mistake I did though. I got 3 plants, planted them in the garden last year, and usually it behaves as an annual. So you want to collect the seed or let it self-seed indeed if you want to have it every year. You've got to gather the seed. It should die back, but last year, because we planted it so late, it actually just produced a nice leaf rosette, behaved itself. This year, the flower spikes are 5 foot tall. Now, we knew this beforehand, and we planted it in an area where it can kind of spread out and have a bit of space. But it's right in front of our window, and the pollinators go to it first. So it's an absolutely fantastic plant. Again, you need to kind of collect the seed or let it self-seed where it is to have this every year. Otherwise, it will kind of die out in your garden. So it's by and large meant to be an annual, but we've had it as a biennial species. And it tends to attract long-tongued pollinators because the flowers, as you can see, have a bit of a tube at the back here. So the long-tongued bumblebees and things like that. But what you will find the short-tongued bumblebees doing is they'll actually nibble a hole in the side of the flower to get to the nectar. So they kind of cheat a little bit. So it's beneficial to both long and short-tongued insects. Again, another very common species in sort of older gardens and really widely sold in garden centres and nurseries is Montbracia crocosmia. Now, there's lots of different species and hybrids of crocosmia. We have a few in the garden as well. The only one that is invasive is this hybrid crocosmia X crocosmia flora. So it's this orange flowered one, which is a bit of a thug in the garden. Now, it actually spreads in 2 ways, primarily vegetatively in this part of the world. So it has little corms underneath the ground, which are a type of bulb, if you like. And every year they bud a new corm off the parent one. So it can form these really, really dense single species stands. And if you're ever in the west of Ireland, where this stuff is just forms carpets along the roadside, the thickets and these dense patches of corm so dense that nothing else can grow in there, and it's very, very woody, so it's even very difficult to dig out as well. So again, in a garden setting, it can become a bit of a thug because you think you've dug it all out. All it takes is 1 or 2 little corm fragments to be left in the soil, and it just regrows again. So this is one we would tend to stay away from. There are other species of crocosmia that you can get that are much better behaved in the garden, but it's this orange flowered hybrid that I would definitely stay away from. And again, this is an attempt at digging up all the corms. You can see just how much there is. So yeah, just a bit of a thug in the garden. A much more viable alternative is this species, which is a native species, yellow flag iris. It's our only native iris species. It has those nice tall strappy leaves. You can even get a variegated form, which we have in the garden. Again, if you just want something a wee bit different. Produces these lovely flowers. And again, you can get different colored flowers in this species in some of the more specialist nurseries. It gives you the same visual impact, also equally beneficial for pollinators, but it grows much more slowly by these underground, quite sort of thick, fleshy rhizomes, and it's much easier to dig out and split. In 5 or 10 years, when it does form quite a big stand, it's much easier to control. So it has all the benefits of Crocosmia. It's a native species, so it benefits of pollinators, and it's much, much easier to control as well. So what we'll maybe do at this stage is maybe stop for a wee 15-minute break. So I'll let everyone just have a toilet break, cook up a brew, something like that. If we meet back at about 11:15, we'll then carry on looking at some more troublesome garden species. Okay, folks, so I'll see everyone in 15 minutes at 11:15.
Okay, perfect.
Super. Okay, so we'll jump straight back in and pick up where we left off. So hopefully by now it's evident that there are certain themes amongst our more invasive garden plant species that make them just a bit of a nightmare, a bit of a nuisance to manage. So they might produce seed very profusely. It also depends on how that seed is dispersed outside of your garden. So is it by birds? Is it by wind? A lot of species spread vegetatively, which can make them form these big monoculture, these single species stands that dominate your garden, and so on. So again, in a garden setting, some of these species can even be difficult to look after if they're managed intensively, through the growing season. Some of them, if you cut the seed heads off, they don't go to seed. They can be a little bit more easily tamed in your garden, as long as you can manage it every year. So another species, which again you'll see in garden centres and you also see out in the wild quite a bit with increasing frequency, is this stuff. It's sometimes called Japanese Caria or bachelor's buttons. And there's a single flowered species and a double flowered species, which is called Pleniflora. Generally, what I would say with regards to garden plants is if you want to attract pollinators, stay away from double flowered varieties of plants, because obviously it's a lot harder for the pollinators to get into where the pollen and the nectar is. Whereas with single flowers, you can see the nectary guides, the lines here, very clearly telling the pollinators where to go to get the nectar and gather up pollen on their way. So double flowered plants look nice for us, but they're pretty terrible for pollinators. So if you do like a little bit of a wildlife garden, try and stay away from double flowered and go for single flowered cultivars. That aside, Caria japonica again starts off quite slow, quite nice, but it can get quite tall. And as you can see, cast a bit of a dense shade here, and it can just act as a bit of a thug. It'll spread by rhizomes, underground storage organs, and create kind of thickets, which can make it a bit of a nightmare to kind of dig out over a few years. And again, it can turn up in unwelcome places like between paving slabs and things like that, to the detriment of other plant species. So one to kind of stay away from. Again, if you put it in a pot and you don't let it go to seed, you can manage it very easily. But it's when you plant it in the open ground in your garden and just leave it be without any control, it can become a bit of a thug. So one to stay away from, certainly the double flowered form, which is no real advantage for biodiversity. An alternative, which again can form, quite sort of woody growth, woody thickets that are much more easily managed in your garden, and both native species are elder, which obviously attracts a lot of especially solitary bees and smaller insects and even flower beetles and things to the composite flowers in the spring and early summer. And also the berries that are produced later in the summer, early autumn are a source of food for birds and small mammals. And also both the flowers and the berries can be used by us as well. So elderflower cordial, elderflower fritters, elderberry wine, all that sort of stuff. So it's a very, very useful plant to have in the garden anyway. And there are lots of horticultural cultivars available, like black lace, this one here, where the leaves are a very dark blacky purple color and the flowers are a purpley pink color. Confers all the same advantages to biodiversity, just looks a little bit different and is casts a little bit less shade on the ground underneath because of the more dissected leaves as well. So if you don't like the straight species, which of course you can get from the wild by germinating your own berries or your own seeds, you can get slightly more difficult cultivars in garden centres and nurseries. Being a native species, it does have natural diseases and predators and things, and pests. So it also grows a lot more slowly than the likes of bachelor's buttons, and it can be coppiced very, very effectively. So if it does still get a bit too tall, branches start to splay out a little bit and dominate, overtake a corner of your garden, you can just cut that back quite heavily in the autumn and winter when all the sap's retreated down into the roots, and just keep it in check. So quite easy to manage. Same with hazel. Hazel takes to coppicing really well. Actually, you might argue it benefits and prolongs the life of the plant by coppicing it every few years. And again, it produces these catkins, these pendulous catkins, which are the female or the male flowers, sorry, which disperse the pollen in early to mid-spring. And these are also visited by early pollinators as well. So the early bumblebees and things like that. And again, the leaves can cast a bit of a dense shade on the ground underneath. So if you like to have different layers in your garden, you might be able to thin out some of the branches of your hazel and coppice it every 5 or so years, just to keep it nice and open and airy and allow a little bit of light into the ground. You can plant bulbs and things around about. But these are both native species, so very beneficial to biodiversity. And again, for those of you into wildlife gardening, it's actually quite nice to come out and see some of your garden plants with nibbles in the leaves, because it means that plants in your garden, whether they're native or non-native, are actually part of the local ecosystem. So we have roses in the back with the leaf cutter bees come in every summer, take these crescent-shaped chunks out of the leaves, take them back to their nests, and they're feeding their grubs, and that's fine because the rose still grows just fine. So a lot of these plants that you plant, if there are nibbles out of the leaves, that's actually you're conferring a benefit to biodiversity, even though as a gardener, you might want everything to be kind of prim and proper and perfect. It's nice to kind of kick back and just let nature do its thing sometimes. So another group of sort of woody shrubs that can be a bit of a problem in the garden, and even in amenity areas and along roadsides, are very widely planted, are the cotoneasters. Now there's lots of different species and hybrids that you can get in garden centres and nurseries, but there's only 5 main ones that we know are a bit of a problem because they've spread out into the wild, have naturalised to the detriment of our native biodiversity. So the first is probably the most widely available of all the cotoneasters. It's wall cotoneaster, usually the one you see trained up walls and road embankments and places like that. Cotoneaster horizontalis, and the branches grow in these nice sort of flattish sprays, which are all quite sort of herringbone-like, with these side branches are very straight and parallel to each other. Nice little white flowers about this time of the year, late summer to early autumn, lots of red berries, which are a food source for birds. And this is where the problem lies. While it's great for pollinators at this time of the year, when the birds eat the berries, carry them all over the countryside, defecate them out, and they germinate very, very readily. And you'll see cotoneasters growing in all sorts of weird and wonderful places, even in some of our ASSI's, areas of special scientific interest, and also nature reserves as well. And there's 2 such sites, ASSI's in Fermanagh, where cotoneaster, I think it's microphyllus, this one here, small leaf cotoneaster, is actually grown naturalized to the detriment of some quite rare limestone grassland plant species. So in England and Wales, it's been illegal to sell these 5 cotoneaster species since, I think, 2014. Northern Ireland, is obviously a little bit behind in everything with the legislation, and so you can still buy these species readily and plant them in your garden. But to be honest, there are lots of other cotoneaster species and hybrids you can buy that aren't invasive, don't have that same problem. So I'd certainly stay away from these 5 if you can. Once they go to berry and the birds eat the berries, that's where the problem lies. Not so much of a problem in your garden where you can prune them and keep them in check. It's when the berries and the seeds get taken outside of your garden that the sort of biodiversity issue arises. And 2 alternatives would be junipers. So there's our native juniper, Juniperus communis. You can find this in as all sorts of cultivars in nurseries and garden centres. The one which looks most like the wild type here is called Juniperus communis green carpet. Don't think you can buy the straight species in not that I've seen in Northern Ireland. As a wild species, this is actually a very rare species. It's very, very localized as to where it's found nowadays. So by planting some in your garden, you're actually helping it to stay in your local area and to spread, which is great. As you can see, it can form nice carpets, but it's quite slow growing. Again, birds will eat the berries, but because this is a native species, if they go and poop out the berries somewhere in an ASSI or a nature reserve, that's actually a good thing because it's helping to spread this native species across the wider environment. If you do want to grow some juniper to grow your own juniper gin, number 1, you'll probably be waiting a while because it's quite slow growing. Number 2, just as with holly, as we mentioned earlier on, it's only the female juniper that produces the berries. The males don't. So again, you have to wait until the plants flower, look at the flower through a little hand lens, see whether it's male or female, and you need both male and female in your garden to eventually get these berries. And the plants need to be fairly mature before they'll produce any berries. So beautiful when you can get it to happen. I'm still waiting on mine to produce some berries, and they're about 5 years old, so it is a bit of a wait. But once they do, obviously you'll be helping local biodiversity by having a native plant species in your garden, which is quite a rare species in the wild too. If you like more of your ornamental stuff, there's Japanese juniper, Juniperus squamata. Again, you can get lots of cultivars, behaves itself very well in the garden, spreads quite slowly. There's one called blue carpet, which spreads carpets out just like this. Acts as good evergreen ground cover, and I say doesn't become a thug, which is very, very viable alternative to some of the ground cover cotoneasters. Another 2 very viable alternatives would be yew, which most people think of as an upright tree. You can get prostrate forms. So this is Taxus baccata, I think it's called Rapanda, prostrate yew with the normal coloured needles, and this one is another prostrate form with yellow gold needles I think it's called summer gold, both horticultural varieties of our native yew species. And again, you need the female trees to produce those red berries, which are actually toxic to people, but edible by birds and small mammals. And you also need a male nearby to obviously fertilize the female flowers. So another very viable alternative is Ceanothus or California lilac. And the best ground cover form, which would be an alternative to your cotoneasters, would be one called Ceanothus tharsiflorus repens, which, as you can see, forms mounds that kind of carpet the ground quite nicely. And like junipers and yew, this is an evergreen ground cover as well, so it helps to keep the weeds down and is very easily maintained. And it's also really, really popular with pollinators as well. So a few very viable and colourful alternatives to cotoneaster. Now, hopefully, there's few people have giant rhubarb in their garden. Our current house, when we moved in, the crazy man that had the house before us had giant rhubarb all over the back garden. Very ornamental, obviously, if you have enough space to grow it. But this isn't the edible rhubarb, which is much, much smaller. This is grown purely as as an ornamental plant. And there are 2 that 2 of these giant rhubarbs are gunneras, which can be quite problematic, especially in acidic soils in the west of the province and in Western Ireland. So if you go to the likes of Sligo and Galway, Achill Island, places like that, you'll see Gunnera along with Montbretia and all sorts of other invasive species growing along the roadsides quite profusely. And of course, you can see just how dense the shade is underneath those huge leaves, which can be up to about 2 meters wide. Big, impressive plant, but when it escapes into the wild, maybe as discarded garden waste, which of course always happens somewhere in the country. People don't want plants in the garden, they dig them up, throw them into the road verge, and they grow into these big monsters. So while they're impressive in your garden, they're terrible in the wild, and they produce 2,500 seeds a plant, or a flower spike, and each plant can produce quite a few dozen flower spikes. So you're probably looking at quite a few million seeds produced by one of these big plants every year. So it can seed very profusely where it grows. And it can also spread vegetatively as well from broken rhizome fragments. The good news is it's quite easy to get out of your garden. It's very shallow rooted, and the stems and the rhizomes are very, very fleshy. They're almost like sponge. So it's very easy to dig out and to compost in your garden. But again, only a real problem where the soils are quite wet and acidic. So you'll find this growing in drains and along the margins of bogs in the west of Ireland. So a few people might have this in their garden, but hopefully not too many people. And the one that's really problematic is Gunnera tinctoria. Manicata, although it grows slightly larger, it doesn't in this part of the world seem to be just as invasive for whatever reason, but in other parts of the world it is. So 2 species to definitely avoid putting in your garden if you can. And this is another one that seems to be turning up with increase in frequency as a garden escape, either as garden waste or it just literally spreads under the fence line into natural habitat, which is variegated yellow archangel. So it's this one with the silvery variegations on the leaves. And very, very ornamental and attractive, as you can see close up with the flower spike on the right there. Nice flowers, nice foliage. In sheltered areas, it can be evergreen, so produce nice ground cover, but it is a real thug. Once it gets a nice, well-established root system, it spreads very quickly vegetatively by runners, and it can spread in ideal, nice fertile soils, can spread up to 2 meters a year, which is hard to keep that in check. So again, it's just a species you're best avoiding. So this is one that seems to be causing more and more of a problem as time goes on. And it can, in the wild, this species, yellow archangel, which actually is a native species in the south of Ireland, would grow in very shaded conditions. So even under the cover of quite dense shade in your garden, or maybe a wood or something or a hedgerow at the back of your garden, it'll thrive in those shaded conditions as well. So one to kind of avoid if at all possible. And again, a lot of people might maybe like bamboos in their garden, very ornamental, nice sound when they wave in the wind. And there are 2 main types of bamboos. There's what we call the rhizomatous or the running bamboos, which spread by runners underneath the ground. And they're the ones that can be a bit of a nuisance and take over and form these huge stands. And again, we had these in the back garden of our current house. And it took probably 2 or 3 years of digging them up and digging them up. Every time you would think you've got them all, they resprout, you've got to dig them up and dig them up. And it can take quite a few years to actually get them all out. So it's pretty terrible stuff to have in your garden. If you really like the look of some of these running bamboo species, plant them in a huge big pot where they can't get out into your wider garden. But once they get a foothold, they can be really tricky to establish. And again, these can naturalize themselves in woodlands and other habitats outside of estates and gardens. You will occasionally see them growing in brownfield sites in urban and residential areas as well, where they're again a bit of a nuisance to try and get rid of. So again, you can see just how dense the shade is underneath those, and nothing else is going to grow within a bamboo thicket. And unfortunately, there's probably more of these sold in garden centres and nurseries than the second type, which are what you call the clumping bamboos, which, as you can see, tend to form a much more manageable clump. So they don't produce these runners that go sideways, and they kind of behave themselves a lot more. And again, the light can get in underneath, so you can grow stuff underneath them. And they're just much nicer and easier to look after, if you ask me. But definitely look for some of these species if you want bamboos in your garden, rather than some of these slugs here. And another plant that's very, very common in gardens, especially cottage gardens, are the Japanese anemones and their hybrids. So again, produce flowers all the way through the growing season, beautiful to look at, but once they get established, they can be a bit of a nightmare to get rid of. They'll self-seed all over the place, so they kind of take over that way. And as you can see, they kind of shade out everything else underneath. They form big, big clumps. And again, we have these in the front garden. It's taken 3 years and we're still pulling out the odd plant here and there. So it just takes quite a bit of time and persistence to get rid of some of these species. There are, however, as time goes on, some horticultural varieties being produced which are sterile or which are less invasive. So there's anemone wild swan. If you really like your Japanese anemones, do a bit of research. You can find species cultivars which aren't invasive or are sterile, so they don't self-seed all over the place. And again, these are native to temperate China. I think Central Eastern China, somewhere like that. Nice temperate climates, similar to our own, but they would have diseases and pests and things in the wild that would keep them in check there, whereas they don't have those here, so they can just grow and run rampant without any fear of being kept in check. And another species which behaves in exactly the same way is Columbine, Aquilegia species. The native species is Aquilegia vulgaris, but again, in the wild, it has to compete with other plants. It has insects that graze it and things like that. In a garden setting, especially with some of the non-native species and hybrids that are grown in our gardens, there's nothing to keep them in check, and they can self-seed all over the place to the detriment of other plants in your garden. And they will also, of course, that seeds will spread into natural habitats as well, where again, there's nothing to keep them in check. So again, if you do want these in your garden, as with the Japanese anemones, but you don't want them to end up taking over, deadhead the flowers, don't let them go to seed. So you just have to be on top of them at the end of the growing season. And there's lots of viable alternatives to these sort of tall herbaceous perennials that produce nice flower heads. So your Japanese anemones, your columbines, and these are all native species. So there's water ravens, Geum ravali. There's common fleabane, which is an annual. So again, you'll have to either let that seed every year, or you'll have to collect the seed and germinate that in the greenhouse. And there's oxeye daisy, which seems to be one of the most popular wildflowers in people's gardens. And it's a perennial species, so it'll just come back year after year after year. There's corn marigold, which is another annual species. Again, you'll have to let it set seed to get it every year, or gather the seed and germinate that yourself. And as its name suggests, this would have been an old cornfield annual in amongst arable crops. It used to actually be a real pest. But now, because of sort of widespread herbicide use, much more efficient sort of cleaning techniques for agricultural grain, it's very, very rare in the wild now. So again, by planting species like this in your garden, you're actually helping to conserve native species, which are nowadays quite rare in the wild. So you're not only helping pollinators, but you're also helping plant diversity as well, and local conservation. Red campion, another very common wildflower in people's gardens. Nice tall purpley red flower spikes. And a relative, ragged robin, which tends to grow in slightly wetter, more damp soils. So if you have quite clay, water retentive soils, ragged robin would be one to consider. You can also get a white flowered variety for the garden if pink isn't your thing. And you can also get one which stays quite short. So if you've quite a windy, exposed garden, maybe by the coast, you can get some of these plants in sort of dwarf or ground hugging forms as well. And also field scabious, these nice sort of purpley blue flower heads that are very popular with pollinating insects in late summer. And another alternative, which is definitely thinking outside the box, are the sea hollies, Eryngium species. Now, there's only one species of Eryngium which is native to Ireland. It's just called sea holly, and it grows on coastal sand dunes. It's very, very rare in Northern Ireland. And so you're very unlikely to actually get it in garden centres and nurseries, but there are lots of other Eryngium species, which as you can see are quite spiky, which are very, very good for pollinators, and they do tend to behave themselves quite a bit in the garden. So let's see, we've got Eryngium alpinum. This is alpine sea holly. This is from the Alps in Europe. We've got Eryngium planum, which is from Central Europe, and Eryngium giganteum, which is a nice big silver flowered variety. So very, very ornamental and attractive in the garden. And they're perennial, so they come back every year, but very, very beneficial for pollinators, and they behave themselves as well. They will produce seed, but not massive amounts of it. And then onto some thuggish climbers as well. So Russian vine, or as its very apt alternative name of mile a minute plant suggests, it grows really, really quickly, very, very vigorous. So quite often it's planted to hide maybe ugly fences, or maybe you've got a concrete wall out your back, you want to plant something up it to hide it. This would be the thing to do it. But after the first few years, once it really gets its deep root system established, it'll take over and it'll outgrow the space that it was intended to fill, as you can see here. And if you look at the Latin name Fallopia, it's related to the bindweeds, which can also be a bit of a nightmare in the garden. And it's also related to Japanese knotweed, which also is a well-known invasive species, very similar flower spikes as well. So this is a species which again grows like absolute stink in this part of the world. Nice temperate weather, nothing to keep it in check. And it can do a lot of damage where it grows on sheds and buildings and things like that. So it can be much more than just a nuisance. Again, if you're driving along the M2, past the old sort of Thompson's grain mill on the left, heading northwards, you'll see lots of this growing on the railway embankments. It's been there for years, and every year it just gets further along the embankment. So really want to stay away from. But although we know it's a real thug, it's still sold in nurseries and garden centres, which is crazy. Another one which can be a bit of a thug, not to the same extent as Russian vine, but can do quite a bit of damage to sheds and outbuildings, walls and houses, is Virginia creeper. And again, it's used to hide big boring looking walls, nice sort of 5-lobed leaves, hence the term quinquefolia. And in autumn, all those leaves turn in lovely scarlet red before they drop off. So it is deciduous. And it grows quite quickly. If that gets underneath your soffit boards or your roof tiles or in around your gutters, it can do a lot of damage to your roof. And not many people want to get up a 2-story ladder and cut this back every year. So it can do a lot of damage if not planted in the right place. So another one to probably stay away from if you see it in garden centres. Now there are alternatives, some native, some not, but they're all much better behaved. So there's common jasmine, which of course is nicely scented as well. So you can plant it beside wherever you sit in the back garden. In the evening time and humid this time of the year, you get a nice scent off it. Quite popular with pollinators as well. There's our native honeysuckle, Linicera periclymenum. Really, it's scented as well. So you'll smell this in the evenings. And it also attracts long-tongued pollinators like moths as well. So hawk moths and things like that would visit. And again, these are a lot less vigorous than Virginia creeper and Russian vine. And there's countless varieties of clematis or clematis that you can buy in garden centres now. None of them are native to this part of the world, but they do provide good cover for walls and fences and trellis and stuff like that. And there are a few types of clematis to watch out for, though. They can grow really quickly and again get under your gutters and things and do a bit of damage. So there's Clematis montana, which is the most commonly sold species, is the one that grows really fast and can act like a seal and pull wooden fences down and that sort of stuff. Very, very floriferous. So when it's in flower, it looks absolutely beautiful, but it grows kind of a meter a year, if not slightly more. So it really can take over. So again, as with all the plants before, just do a little bit of research, find out what size it eventually gets to, and if it's too big, then just don't buy it. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. So we've been through quite a lot of different species there of garden plants, and hopefully some viable alternatives as well. So what we'll probably do is go into the chat here and just have a little look at the questions. Excuse me. And let's see. Again, if anyone has any questions, just pop them into the chat. So we've covered quite a bit of information there this morning. So maybe something didn't make sense or something just needs clarification, fire across in the chat there, and we'll get it answered.
Yeah, or if you prefer, you can turn on your camera or keep your camera off and just ask questions on mute there. Yeah.
Carl, I have a question. If you have existing species in your garden, is it worth removing them, or only really if they're causing an issue? Like, at what stage do you just leave them?
Yeah, good question. It really depends on what the species is and how it spreads. So if it's a species that maybe would have berries, so birds could actually distribute it around the local countryside outside of your control, I would probably get rid of it. Whereas if it's a species like Japanese anemone or something which you can deadhead before it seeds all over the garden and causes a nuisance, then if you really like it, you could keep it. But if you just don't have the time to do that, then I would probably just dig it up and compost it.
And is there much of a price difference in buying native and the more ornamental types? Like, I'm not a gardener, but I'm just thinking of our garden at home has quite a lot of ornamentals, and would they not be more pricey?
Yeah, again, a good question. From my experience, at the moment, it is a wee bit trickier to buy native, because obviously not everywhere sells native, but it is something that's catching on. And generally, if you can find things like oxeye daisies or birdsfoot trefoil, yeah, they tend to be quite cheap in comparison. I think one of the reasons for that is it is still a bit of a niche market.
Yeah.
If they're too expensive, people will go, "Ooh, well, I'd rather have this daisy that has 6-inch flowers rather than these wee tiny things that are native, the same price." So yeah, if you can track them down, there are a few nurseries in Northern Ireland that do produce, wildflower seed. And another thing worth considering is, if you do want to put some of these native species into your garden, try and track down the people who are growing them locally, because local provenance plants are really important, because they'll flower at the right time for our pollinators. If you buy them online, they do the same job, but they might be maybe they're produced in southern England, and those particular plants will flower earlier in the year and not just benefit our pollinators quite as much. They'll not coincide with the pollinator breeding season. So yeah, they're not as readily available. It can be cheaper when you find them, but although it's a bit more work to buy local provenance stuff.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Super.
Carl, control of Japanese knotweed, what are the alternatives to chemicals? Is there any really?
Unfortunately, for a lot of these invasive, yeah, there's kind of mechanical control, either by hand if it's small enough, or you can get the digger in, or chemical control. That's the only real viable alternatives, unfortunately. Again, if you just get a little patch of Japanese knotweed, if you get it really early, you could dig it out.
No, big patches.
But yeah, if it's big patches, it's a stem injection job, unfortunately.
Yeah, or overspray.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose they wouldn't call it a good thing necessarily. There's nothing good about Japanese knotweed, but stem injection will target just that species. Whereas obviously overspraying, you can get a wee bit of spray drift into non-target species. But to be honest, if it's a really bad stand of Japanese knotweed and it's not growing somewhere that's species rich, it's probably
no alternative. I mean, it's constant work to get rid of it. Several times a year spraying.
It's
continually monitoring it. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Economically, it can cost quite a bit of money as well, unfortunately. I mean, the interesting thing is that even though it's listed in Schedule 9 of the Wildlife Order, so it's illegal to sell or to plant or allow to spread in the wild, it's actually, there's a new piece of legislation which came in to effect in Northern Ireland, I think it was December 2019, invasive species permitting order, and it's not on that. It actually does make it illegal to plant it in your garden. And the reason the Japanese knotweed isn't on that isn't in this new piece of legislation is because it would then actually force landowners and business owners and house owners to get rid of it, which could bankrupt people, you know. So from an economic point of view, you know, it's not actually, there's no reason to kind of get rid of it now. You know, the new legislation's done away with that, but economically it could just bankrupt people. So it's a very contentious one, but overspray or stem injection would be the two viable alternatives, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a way to sort of do it without using glyphosate or something like that. Obviously, that's the one to take, but unfortunately, it's just for something as pernicious as Japanese knotweed, it's just not viable, you know.
What are we going to do when glyphosate's not available anymore?
It's going to be very, very tricky. I think that's a slippery slope. People are realizing just how insidious it is, you know, for our own health as well as the environment. And yeah, when it goes, that's going to be a very, very tricky one. Good question. I don't think it's one people have the answer for, you know.
No.
You know, I think what we're now realizing is with a lot of these, you know, much more insidious invasive species like Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam, they're so prevalent in the wider environment that we're literally just going to have to learn to live with them, I think, unless they're actually in our way of doing something like building, you know. Because for councils, for example, to get rid of all the invasive species on council land, they wouldn't have any money left, you know. So although there's been a lot of really great work across the wider countryside to get rid of these species and keep them in check, it probably is a losing battle, to be fair. Which is unfortunate, but certainly is it in your garden or?
No, I work with the Forest Service, so we have it in a number of places, and we have to control it. Again, it's been dumped, and it's just taken over in places. Yeah. And, it's a big one to work with.
It's definitely the biggest headache of all of them, you know. It and Himalayan balsam, I think, are the two big ones.
Well, Himalayan balsam is just nothing you can do with it now. It's everywhere.
Just spread along all the river catchments, and it's just everywhere. Yep. One I think we'll just have to learn to live with. But I think Japanese knotweed, because it is so damaging, you know, it can grow through concrete and do a lot of structural damage. It's a real issue, you know. I mean, the rhizomes, the sort of underground parts, I forget how many meters, it's 7 meters, you know, from either, if you see a plant above ground, the rhizomes can grow 7 meters either side of that, and they can also grow up to 7 meters down into the soil profile as well. So if you wanted to excavate that, you know, and not leave any fragment of rhizome, you just imagine the sheer volume of soil you would have to dig out.
Yeah.
It's not feasible, you know.
No. Definitely not.
Sorry, Carl, I live in a very rural area at the foot of a mountain, which I can say is a massive bluebells in May, and I really do hope that they are the proper ones, but I think they are. They've been there for years and years and years. But along our road, there's loads of wild honeysuckle as well. So I've tried growing honeysuckle in my garden twice, and it doesn't grow. So this year or last year, I planted one, and I've got loads and loads of greenery, but I've no flowers yet, and yet it's growing wild along the road, and the flowers are out. So what am I doing wrong, or why have I no flowers?
Good question. How long ago did you plant it?
Last year.
It may just, we would see this with a lot of garden plants, the first year or two, what it's doing is developing a really good established root system.
Okay.
And they tend to put most of their energy into, you know, leafage to then feed the roots. And once its root system gets sufficiently large, it'll then go, okay, I can survive and thrive now, I can reproduce. So it'll then put energy into flowering. So you might find it might take another year or two, but when it flowers, it will really flower, you know.
Oh, good. Because every morning I go out to see if there's a wee bit of a flower in the top. We discussed it.
It is.
So
it's
that's
frustrating.
good. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Karl, I have a few questions here. Just I'm a complete novice, so how do you deadhead a flower? Is that just a matter of cutting the head off completely, or?
Yeah. If it's quite sort of soft, you can even just pinch it between your finger and thumb and pull. With deadheading, usually if you want it to flower again, another reason to deadhead is usually a lot of plants The reason for deadheading is you're diverting the plant's energy from producing seed. So once the flower starts to go over, starts to look a bit rough, deadhead it, it'll then divert that energy, which would have gone into seed production, into producing more flowers, because the natural instinct for the plants to produce seed to propagate itself. But also you want to stop it going to seed if it's an invasive species. So usually I would look down the flower stem and you'll get a little branch, maybe there's a leaf, a side leaf. I would just pinch it off above the leaf, because part of the stem next to the leaf is a node, which is a growing point. And if you nip it off just above that, you're actually stimulating an accumulation of plant growth hormone in the node, which will then throw up another flower stem. So that's kind of the way to deadhead,
Great, thank you. And are there any guidebooks that cover garden invasive species or anything like that?
In terms of garden invasives, not so much. I mean, the kind of go-to one for tackling invasive species is this one. So this would mention a lot of the species that would be the most pernicious ones in the wider environment. Your Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam, giant hogweed, and so on. But also ones which, although they're not illegal to sort of sell or anything anymore, they're rising stars in the invasive species world, if you like. So a lot of the species that we've looked at today would be in that book, like variegated yellow archangel and so on, Himalayan honeysuckle. So that's probably the kind of go-to guidance that we would use, if we're doing invasive species management plans or something like that. We would draw on that. And they used to be, excuse me, you used to be able to go to some websites like Invasive Species Ireland or NetRegs online and get, sort of best practice guidance on how to tackle a lot of these invasives. And I know certainly NIA have shied away from that about issuing best practice guidance, because then if it doesn't work, who then is liable? So a lot of this so-called best practice guidance to getting rid of invasive species, there seems to be a trend of going away from that. And a lot of the information that used to be available online, which was really good, seems to be disappearing from, the online platform. So if you go into somewhere like netregs.com, something like that, there still should be a wee bit of guidance. Or Scottish National Heritage, snh.gov, they're undergoing a lot of trials for invasive species to see, what control methods or combination of control methods will work. The one that springs to mind is salmonberry, for example. Simple spraying doesn't seem to work. It just comes back from underground storage organs. So you seem to need a combination, a little bit of mechanical damage and then spraying to actually sort of hit it. So there's also a lot of ongoing research and trials to work out what's the best, most effective way to get rid of a lot of these species as well. And as I mentioned earlier on, for some of them, we might just have to learn to live with them. Unfortunately, they seem to be here to stay.
All right, thank you. Has anybody any other questions?
I have a lot of black spot on my roses and my garden, and I was wondering how I go about getting rid of it.
Again, it's one of those ones where you can get sprays for black spot. It's just a little fungal infection. We would have black spot on the roses as well, but the plant grows really vigorously and it flowers like stink. So I really try not to use chemicals in the garden unless it's actually starting to affect the health of the plant overall. So again, it just depends on your style of gardening. If you don't want the disease there at all, then certainly spray any black spot off. Whereas if you're like me and you're a little bit more, I'd rather do things a bit more organically unless the plant's health's actually starting to be affected, then I would spray. So it just depends how you want the garden, really. But there are quite specific, fungicidal sprays available out there. And again, you can spot spray that on, so you're not damaging the wider environment as well.
So is it likely to do any harm to the plant? Is it likely to kill it?
It depends just how, we would have, just looking there during the break, we would have quite a lot of black spot on one of our roses, but it's flowering away, it's growing like stink. And there are also certain cultivars of roses that are slightly more resistant to black spot than others. So it might be something worth looking into as well. Roses can be quite problematic, from a disease point of view. because
Yeah.
they're not bred necessarily for disease resistance. They're bred for the flowers and for speed of growth and that sort of thing, you know. But again, that's something that is changing now, and a lot of rose growers are starting to look at more disease resistant strains, because black spot and mildew and things are a big problem, you know. So if your rose does get to the point where you might be spraying and it does start to lose a bit of vigor, you do maybe have to dig it out. It might be worth replacing it with, you know, one that has, you know, black spot resistance, something like that. What we would find too is it really very much depends on where you live as to what diseases your roses would get. I suppose it depends what the neighbours have in their garden, really. So we're quite bad with black spot here, for whatever reason. There's obviously just a lot of it in the fungal spores are in the air, and it's probably the same with yourself. So part of my logic with not really spraying with the black spot spray is that those spores are in the air anyway, and I'm better planting roses that are more resistant to it, and you just have to kind of work with what you have growing in your local area.
Where I live, I have only moved in, and there's been 3 or 4 roses in the garden. So
Okay.
they had it, and now I find a lot of my roses that I have put back in.
It's transferred, right? Okay. Yeah, if it's mild enough, I would probably spray. If it's quite rampant, you could use a lot of spray, to be honest. You could cut it back, you know, cut them back down at the end of the growing season, which probably you want to do anyway, unless it's a rambling rose. And then, you know, well, if the young growth gets infected next year, which it inevitably will, spray that, you know. But if it's not affecting the vigor of the plant and you're happy enough to look at a few black spotted leaves, I'd probably leave it, to be honest.
Okay.
Just depends on your gardening style, you know.
Yeah. Thank you.
No problem.
Anybody, any other questions before we wrap up?
Okay, I'll go for one more then.
Go for it.
Go for it.
Creeping buttercups.
Yeah.
Nightmare in the garden.
Oh, hateful stuff. Yep.
I put tarpaulin down thinking that would actually clear it, because it was for putting bark over the area.
Mhm.
And it has went through the tarpaulin and everything.
It's a real nuisance. It'll actually, when you shade it out, it actually encourages it to grow quicker, because it thinks if I grow this way, I'll grow quicker to reach the light, you know.
So I found,
Yeah, we have massive problems with it in the garden as well. And again, we don't mind a bit of it, but it's when it actually starts to overtake other plants as well. Like we have a lot of clover in the garden, which is, we'll let it flower because it's great for the pollinators. But the buttercup's actually starting to overtake the clover, which is not so good. So the first thing we would do is set the mower slightly lower, so you damage the plants.
yeah.
And then we would spot spray just to keep it in control. You know, we've tried sort of, you know, mechanically pulling them out and things like that, and inevitably it just comes back, you know. So,
That's a nightmare.
the other alternative, of course, which I think we started to do now with part of the garden, is just let your garden go wild. If you do like a bit of a lawn, we do like a bit of a lawn too, but we also like, you know, to have a bit of wild space. So with creeping buttercup is one of those ones that won't just stop at the boundary; it'll kind of grow everywhere. So if you do like a bit of a maintained lawn, which all of us probably need a bit of, yeah, unfortunately it's just a wee bit of spot spraying.
Well, I have done that to the front of the house where I have a maintained lawn, but to the back of the house, it has just went chaos. So it has, and I have a wild garden down at the bottom of the garden.
Yeah.
But it has just went rampant.
Yeah, it's a hard one to get rid of. It's, I think, probably the worst one in our lawn as well. And yeah, we've tried sort of just digging up and reseeding, and we've tried everything. And the only thing that seems to work is just hitting it with like 4-in-1 or something, you know, it feeds the grass, but it also kills broadleaf weeds. It's like a granule you would put on.
Okay.
And I think part of the thing to aim for as well, if you do want to maintain lawn, is to actually not just focus on sort of targeting the creeping buttercup, but also trying to get a nice, really thick sward of grass so that seeds from the buttercup can't get in there. So that's why they like the 4-in-1 granules are quite good, because it'll feed the grass and make it more vigorous while also knocking back the broadleaf weeds as well. And it does, whatever the herbicide in it is, it's not as pernicious as glyphosate either. So it does seem to kind of wash through. It doesn't seem to linger in the environment as well or as long, which is obviously good as well.
And this wouldn't be where it would, I have a wee dog, it wouldn't be.
What we would usually say if we have any pets is, I mean, what we would usually do is sprinkle the granules. Again, if it's only localized areas, you don't have to do the whole lawn. And we would usually sort of fence that area of grass off, because pets obviously will go out and they'll hook and poke at things, and we would usually keep them off it just for a few days. And what you would usually have to do with the granules is water them in. So I mean, we would put the granules on, we would have the sprinkler going, or if we know it's going to rain that night, we'll just let the rain dissolve the granules into the soil.
Yeah.
And just do a little bit of a walkover. If you can't see any granules, then obviously take the fencing away and let the dog back out and do its thing, you know. But yeah, it would definitely be toxic to dogs. I would definitely not let the dogs on with the granules.
Okay. Thank you.
Super. Brilliant. Any other questions? Super. Well, as I say, if anyone does think of any questions, certainly feel free to get in touch through Laura. And if I don't know the answer myself, I can certainly try and find out for you. Anyone that is interested, say, in one thing we deliberately didn't cover today was how to control a lot of these species. And it really is, as I mentioned earlier on, it's kind of the only real two options is mechanical control, be that dead hen to stop seeds being produced, or you digging a plant out if it becomes problematic, or chemical control. I suppose the best advice really I would give is, you know, I'm by no means a vastly experienced gardener either. It's just kind of through trial and error. But from an environmental point of view, I would always try to go the mechanical route and try and take it out by hand, or, you know, with gardening tools first. And if that doesn't work, then be as localized and specific as you can with whatever herbicides you do use. Or you could just decide, you know what, I'm going to have a wild garden. I don't care anymore. This is going to become a wildflower meadow, and the Cretan buttercup can stay. That's kind of that's the sensible option, because you're working with nature, you know. But you know, as a gardener as well as an ecologist, I appreciate that's not what everyone wants in their garden, which is fair enough, you know. So yes, well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this morning, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karl. That was another interesting workshop. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, Karl.
Yep, no problem at all. All the best. Take care, everyone.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.